Welcome to the City of Brandon Doors Open walking tour for 2021. This will be a tour of Brandon's Ghetto, and it'll be about a 1 kilometer tour. And because of the pandemic, we're doing a sort of a virtual tour this year, but people will be able to follow along. I'm your walking tour host, David McConkey. I'm a Brandon history buff and also a columnist with the Brandon Sun. This is Brandon's north end, also called the Flats, and this area was always what you might call the wrong side of the tracks. This was the low-lying area of the city that often flooded. It was the less desirable part of the city, the area with poorer homes, and it was always regarded as like the wrong side of the tracks. And in 1902, the Brandon Daily Sun did a story on Brandon's Ghetto, and that's where we're taking the name from. We're here at 10th Street North and Assiniboine Avenue. We're in front of St. Mary's Ukrainian Catholic Church. Now, this church was built in 1941, and originally both the Ukrainian Catholic and Ukrainian Orthodox had a joint building at the corner of First and Lorne. The building's no longer there, but they had that building in the early 1900s until the congregations were able to build their own churches. And as I said, this church was built in 1941. And if you ever get a chance to actually go inside, it's well worth it. There's a beautiful artwork, murals, furnishings, including by Manitoba artist Leo Mall. Now we're going to walk along Assiniboine Avenue. We're going to stop at a number of other places. We've walked across the street and we're on the west side of 10th Street North on Assiniboine Avenue, and we're in front of the Ukrainian Reading Hall. This hall was built in 1926 and has been a center for years. We're noting the influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe to the Canadian prairies in the 1890s and early 20th century. And this influx had a Brandon connection because our MP, Clifford Sifton, was a member of Wilfrid Laurier's cabinet, and he was particularly interested in diversifying Canada's immigrants away from the United Kingdom and towards Eastern Europe. And he had the insight that, as he said, there were hardy peasants who were anxious to leave Europe and start life under better conditions in a new country. And he recognized that these peasants would make excellent settlers on the prairies. And he's particularly famous for this quote. He was looking for a stalwart peasant in a sheepskin coat, born on the soil, with a stout wife and a half dozen children. Now these immigrants from Eastern Europe, they settled all over southern Manitoba. They originally started as farmers. They had homesteads, but often the homesteads, the farming didn't work out, and they ended up moving to town. And when they moved to Brandon, they often settled in the north end, in this poorer part of town. You know, here in the 21st century, we can often forget the difficulties that those immigrants faced in, a century ago. And one example was an event in May 1899 when a group of prospective homesteaders from Eastern Europe were camped in a place near today's town of Oakburn. And in May 1899, scarlet fever swept through that area, and in that group 43 children and a couple of adults died of scarlet fever, and they're buried in a mass grave, and you can see a monument if you go there today. And I think events like that are reminders of the kind of conditions that those immigrants faced and the hardships that they had to overcome. In fact, I have a quote from Brandon City, which was written in the 1960s. Newly arrived North Side residents of European extraction, given to both bottles and battles, were hailed regularly before the court. And you can just sort of sense that words that might be thought of as being neutral actually had a connotation of discrimination, newly arrived as opposed to the more settled individuals. European extraction, that was to distinguish them from people who had originally come from the United Kingdom. And North Side, which was kind of a code word for the wrong side of the tracks. We've walked down Assiniboine Avenue. We're now at 11th Street North and Assiniboine Avenue at St. Joseph's Polish National Catholic Church. This building was originally built in 1907. The Methodists built this as a mission church serving this area, and then in 1945 it was converted to this Polish National Church. Here we've walked west on Assiniboine Avenue. We're in front of 1117 Assiniboine Avenue. The house was built in 1894 and the grocery part was added in 1914 and is kind of representative of a number of small stores that were here in the area serving the local population. We've walked a block west. We're now at 12th Street North, and the house behind me, 1203 Assiniboine Avenue, was built in 1896, and an example of kind of some of the smaller homes that were in this area. And if you do walk around, a number of the buildings here do date from the 1890s and the first part of the 20th century. Wednesday, January 12th, 1916, there was a horrific train crash, and it illustrated the social conditions of the time. And it was right here. We're actually standing in front of the tracks that go through Brandon, and in 1916 there was a terrific blizzard, and January 12th was very cold. The high was -36, and after the blizzard there were a number of men hired to do snow clearing, and there was a time where there were workers in a snow clearing car, and it was hit by a slow-moving freight train, but 19 men were killed in that accident, and it was one of the worst train accidents in Canadian history. With the exception of McGee, all the dead are Austrians. They are chiefly married men who had applied for the work. In this connection, the officials of the CPR state that they are the only class of men that can be procured for the work, being a hardy type, and driven to undertaking the work by necessity to get food for themselves and their families. Now, even in death, you can see the division in Brandon between the English-speaking individuals who were mainly Protestant and then new immigrants who were Polish or Ruthenian speakers who were mainly Catholic. And you can see that in the Brandon Cemetery. George McGee, who was a CPR employee who was originally from Scotland, is buried separate from the other men, buried in section 16. And the day laborers are all buried in a row. Most of the graves are not marked, and they are buried in section 20 of the Brandon Cemetery. We've walked up 12th Street North, and here we are in front of number 53. And I have a quote from the Brandon Daily Sun of the day after the train accident. A remarkably sad case is that of Ignace Kucharski, whose wife and 7 children live at 53 12th Street North. The eldest of the family is a boy of 17 years, and he had both feet and hands frozen at the wreck yesterday. The woman only gave birth to a daughter last Friday. Fuel and some groceries were sent to the house by a sympathizer. So that's a quote from the Brandon Daily Sun of the day after the train accident, and it gives an idea of the conditions of the time. Here we are at 11th Street North and Stickney Avenue, and we're in front of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now, this church was built in the 1920s, and originally they were part of the Greek church at First and Lorne. And the Ukrainian Orthodox and Ukrainian Catholic, when they were able to build their own churches, they split off and did so when the Ukrainian Orthodox was built in the 1920s. Now, when we're in front of this church, we can think back to the First World War, And when Canada entered the war in 1914, men who had been born in places like Galicia were now regarded as enemy aliens, because Canada was at war not just with Germany but also with Austria. And although these men were happy to leave Austria to come to Canada, because they had been born in Austria, they were regarded as enemy aliens. And during the First World War, men who had not been nationalized or had not been naturalized and become Canadian citizens by 1902 were regarded as enemy aliens. Men who were enemy aliens were imprisoned in the camps during that time. And one of the camps was actually in Brandon. The Canadian military took over the Winter Fair buildings on Victoria Avenue between 10th and 11th and converted those buildings to an internment camp, which operated from the fall of 1914 to the summer of 1916. And up to 900 men were imprisoned there. And then the camp was closed here in Brandon, and the men were sent to work at camps in the national parks on the Alberta-British Columbia border. Now, the internment camps were regarded as appropriate at the time, but afterwards, in more recent years, they were regarded as an injustice. And so work has been undertaken to remember the camps and to remember what happened there, and just kind of vow that Canada not do anything like that again. And in the 1990s, a plaque was set up at City Hall to remember the camps. And then in 2014, on the 100th anniversary of the opening of the camps, 2 plaques were installed in Brandon. One was at the campsite itself, which is now the parking lot of the police station, and the other was here at this church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We're standing in front of the Sokol Hall on 11th Street North, and the Polish Sokol Association. Sokol was a physical education program that was started in the 1800s in Austria-Hungary, and the founder of Sokol was actually the inventor of gymnastics as a sport in the 1800s. Sokol is a Polish word meaning folk. Now, I have another quote from the Brandon Daily Sun article in 1902, which again illustrates the conditions of the people who lived here. There in a small shanty was noticed a tired wife and mother. She had just returned from a hard day's washing, nursing her 3-year-old baby boy, who'd been cared for by a neighbor throughout the long day. She looked up and meekly smiled. On a stove in the corner of the shack was being cooked the supper for herself, her husband, who had just completed his 10-hour day handling the shovel, and her 4 little ones, all of whom flocked around her like little young chickens with the mother. Now, I'd like to mention about a program that was instituted in Manitoba in the early 20th century. There was the issue of immigrants coming to the prairies who didn't speak English, and the issue of how they could learn English. And there was actually a bilingual program set up in the early part of the 20th century, and there was a bilingual Ruthenian English program, and there was actually a training program for teachers, and it was in Brandon, where the training was from 1907, and then the program was ended in 1916. And Manitoba even arranged to write and publish a special book called the Brandon Ruthenian English Reader. And this was actually a very successful program, and there was a lot of interest in it, not only throughout Manitoba, but also in Alberta and Saskatchewan, as a way for Ruthenian speaking people, or children, to learn English. Now, in 1916, the program was ended. It was partly during the hysteria of the First World War, but also all bilingual programs were ended in Manitoba, and all copies of the Ruthenian English Reader were ordered to be destroyed. Now, in other places, like in the city of Brandon, the school division decided not to open a bilingual school, but instead to teach students just with kind of a English-only program. And in 1916, the Manitoba Department of Education undertook a study of the bilingual program and also schools in Manitoba, in Brandon, where they were learning only English, where they didn't have the bilingual program. And one of the classrooms in Brandon at the time, 1916, you can kind of get a sense of what it was like. There were 28 students, and this is a quote from the teacher. "Pupils are allowed to start school at the age of 5, so that they may have the advantage of an extra year in the English language. The 28 pupils here are all in grade 1 and are just learning English. It is the language usually used on the playground." So there she's saying, this was before there were kindergartens, she was saying that students, they had opened up the schools for an extra year, for students to come and get an extra year before grade 1 to learn English. And you can imagine why English was the language used in the playground, because that was the common language. And here are the 28 students. This is the wording that they used in 1916 to describe those students. Here was the breakdown. This is in Brandon. Of the 28 students, 2 Hebrews, 11 Ruthenians, 2 Austrians, 2 Germans, 7 Poles, 4 Canadians. We've now come to the end of the tour. We're back at St. Mary's Ukrainian Catholic Church. We've come around to here at 10th Street North and Assiniboine Avenue. I have one more quote from the Brandon Daily Sun from 1902. "They form almost a village by themselves. Children, ranging from crying infants to cheeky 10-year-old boys, are to be seen in large numbers in the neighborhood. The young ones talk English almost as well as their mother tongue, and as they grow old enough, they are sent out to find work. The condition of these people, although apparently living in filth, is on the whole improving. They are saving and spending little. As soon as they have sufficient cash, they move to larger and cleaner quarters, their place being filled by new arrivals. Such is life among the foreigners on the flats." Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the tour.